Well, at 76, I'm mainly dead, so I don't have a lot of future left. Maybe 10, 20 years at the most. I mean, I wouldn't think even 20. But I'm a person who tries to plan, certainly, for everything. Well, I was a teacher. I was in the Army. I was in the Air Force. I was a rancher. I was a business owner. I mean, if you live in a small town, you have to have a lot of things going to live there, uh, to live well. As far as money, in high school, I worked on a carpenter's crew during the summer. And then in college, I later worked at the library on the university campus. And then I got a contract from Fredericksburg in the mail to be teaching in Fredericksburg. The superintendent here knew me and my family and thought I should teach here. And so I taught immediately here. And I taught 2 years and got pulled into Vietnam, was in Vietnam for a year, came back in 72, married Peggy. We're married, well, today, 49 and 3/4 years.
Congratulations.
8 June, July, we'll be married 50. And had Jeffrey in a year or so. And then we built in the country on the family ranch, lived out there ever since. And I've been very involved with historical things. I was in the historical society since I was 13 or 14 years old. Chaired it a number of times. I've been commission chairman for most of the past 40 years for the markers, putting markers on the buildings and sites for the state. I sponsored the oldest junior historian club in Texas. Well, they're supposed to learn an appreciation of history, and we didn't do the papers that some of the earlier people had done because, people want to write what's been written or what, not too much original stuff after a period. So we went to sites, and I taught them. Like when I taught, I gave a tour of architecture, and the superintendent said, well, what has that got to do with Texas history? I said, that is a life skill. If you notice things on homes and interiors and gables and sawtooth on gingerbread and all of that, that's a lifetime skill. Those people will. And one time I was doing that, and there were some girls that had gone with home economics to the high school in a different bus, and the teacher told me, how they were saying when they'd been in Mr. Treibs' class, they remembered this for the house and that for the house. The Texas Star or a wagon wheel window or anything like that. We studied the architecture of the town. And I tried to do history treasure hunts, but I did it 2 years. But that's liability in action. The first year, the children ran down the street to find all the items I had, and I thought they'd be killed at the intersections. The second year, I tried to have a lot of parents. Well, the parents stood there while the children ran down the street, so that didn't help. And I thought, it's dangerous. They're excited. They won't look for the traffic. But they had to find certain type of house with a keyhole of a certain type, the transom with arrows, the only palm tree on Main Street. And they really enjoyed that. But it's hard to corral enthusiastic children on Main Street. Well, in addition to ranching, we've had a number of B&Bs, and that's a big investment to have a house yard for that purpose. And we still have one in the historic district, and it's getting to be harder at 76 than it was earlier. Because every week you have to do the entire house and yard. And I'm local. I think on a 2-block street there on Cora, I'm probably the only person that does my yard, and my wife is the only one that does the house. Everybody has help. You see beautiful yards in town, but that isn't the pride of the owner like it was when they did it themselves. And my daughter-in-law even wanted to get me a yard person. I said, no, save that. I need it for something else maybe. That's been a passion since little. We have 2 family trunks from 2 of the 8 families, and we have items they brought in them. It was never about the monetary or such. It was the family heritage. And so one radio station from Germany said, you have more antiques from Germany than German families had. Because they don't, generally after the war, they just threw things away. They wanted new stuff. Literally, I knew a man who said my mother threw everything out of the second floor window and got new furniture when she could. And there's still a habit on Germany of leaving an antique or something on the curb and people can get it if they want it. A lot of military people picked up beautiful things that way. So it's again, when there's an affluence, then there's more immediate thought than of the past. Mm-hmm. The Kleiderschrank, what we call them, the armoire you call, they were usually shifted to the garage or the barn or something in many cases, because that's where they've been rediscovered. But everything has a period, and like, coal oil lamps might have been put in the barn, and then later they're collectible, but not as collectible as some things, because some things were my mother always wondered what happened to my grandmother's bustle, that big wire basket you put around your waist to accentuate your rear end to make your waist look smaller. That was their purpose. She couldn't understand what happened. Then I read the women of America in World War I gave their bustles towards a battleship. So that's why bustles would be very rarely found. And then there's another reason why so many old implements are not found, because of the scrap drives in World War II. If they had a newer tractor and newer equipment, that heavy metal they brought to town for the war effort. So some people who weren't quite as patriotic, they might have kept theirs, and it's still there. The first one comes to mind, that I could organize all my things, get my buildings in order, and my whole paperwork in order before I die. My wife always thought if she were terminally ill, she'd want to go on a tour of the world. I wanted to paint the barns and clean everything up and sit there and wait. That's very true characteristics of the way our people were. They said that when the Indians come now in May and they agree to be called Indians, that they don't chatter like we do. They wouldn't be good at a cocktail party. Even to this day, if they've been on the reservation. One of the men who came to speak to us today at our 175th meeting said that years ago he went to an Indian Presbyterian church in Oklahoma, and afterward they were going to have a covered dish dinner, and he was a scholar, so he timed it. He said it was 35 minutes before one of those 40 people said one word at that dinner. They ate and they didn't talk. And the Germans could have been close to that, but not anymore. I mean, we're very social people. That's what, not the Methodists, they couldn't go. They were, fundamentalists when they got here, because they even had a 4-foot wall down the middle of the church so the sexes couldn't see each other, and had double doors for the males and females, which our churches had gone past that. They had a single double door. But they sat on opposite sides. The men or widowers originally sat on the left side when you came in from the days of the Vereinskerje, and the women on the right. And I joked one time that I said, I wonder who the first woman was to go across the aisle, because it wouldn't have been a man. You could bet the ranch it wasn't a man that went and sat on the women's side. And they said at the Cave Creek Lutheran Church, we remember what woman it was that went to the other side. I forget her name. But yes, dances, the Lutherans and Catholics danced. Originally, the men sat on the right and the women and children on the left, and then some boy thought it was such a big thing to go across the aisle at a certain age, 8, 10, 12, whatever it was, and they got to sit with their fathers, and then they really had to sit straight. It was like when, Lyndon Johnson had his picture taken when he had his first long pants. There was a certain period in your childhood when you become a young man and you got your first long slacks. And he had his picture taken. He was so proud of those. I guess they had a few nickels at that time. But My dad said we harassed Edgar Treibs all day confirmation because his family bought him last long pants, and we kept saying who he thought he was and on and harassed him, and we were insanely jealous that he had those long pants. Yeah, dances were so big. That was culture clash in my family because my father had been a Methodist and mother was a German Lutheran, and her father played in the dance band, so she danced from little on, and he never danced a lick, and that was hard for her. Young people, well, they weren't even young. That was a second marriage. His wife and child died, and her husband died, but they were still young and dumb, I guess, and they were, physically attracted or something, but they were not. He was a rancher who would have saved up for a plow, and she wanted different furniture in the kitchen or something. So they divorced when I was 3. But he was totally not against dancing, but they didn't learn it, they didn't go, and then she grew up in it. Could name people where he couldn't do anything right ever, and other people who respected him. I'll tell you what, there was nobody else in the United States who could pass civil rights in the 60s except Lyndon Johnson. He would threaten or bribe or set up a cot in the legislature at night to browbeat people, and he got it through. And it was just impossible to do civil rights legislation at that time. So it's not Vietnam he was hated about. Those people were draft dodgers, and they got over it when the war was over. They didn't hate him anymore so much. But the South, for the civil rights, that hatred continues with some of them. No, he carried the presidential election. He carried Gillespie County. They said he had tears in his eyes because what's strange about a Gillespie County is it's Republican, but it was Republican during the Civil War. And when Lyndon Johnson, our own boy, brought about civil rights, the entire South after that flipped to the Republican Party. Well, since they flipped to a different party, you would think that Gillespie County would have flipped to it. But a lot of the ranchers, we've been that, we don't want to think about it. We don't know anything about it. We're going to die like our parents. I mean, and literally, the South flipped, but Gillespie County didn't. So, most people only know about politics or most items what they hear from somebody else. But that's a true statement that we didn't flip when everybody else did. But he passed civil rights and #1 education president, and more public lands and parks than any president to his time. And Lady Bird's beautification of the highways and all the other stuff. The public radio, he did. So many things.
Which became
that
the PBS that we.
Yes, he was an absolute toot. He was not above many things to get something done. But then again, if he affected millions. When I was a child, we had a separate movie theater here for Hispanics. If they came to the Palace Theater, they had to sit in the balcony. If I went to their theater, I could sit anywhere. And if a Hispanic truck full of migrant workers came, they had to go to the back door and get their food out of the kitchen. And I had a sergeant in San Antonio who hated my guts because I was Fredericksburg. And I thought, my God, the entire world comes to Fredericksburg. Everybody loves Fredericksburg. You're in Houston and the clerk says, oh, I love your town. And he hates Fredericksburg. Well, I asked another Hispanic friend to find out why. And he had been a migrant worker and they hadn't been allowed to come in the restaurant. And, you can rationalize if you have 30 extremely poor people that don't necessarily have the standards of the Vanderbilts as far as decorum, that the owner could be prejudiced in that way. You should never be prejudiced and be ugly to people, but it was, he hated me because I was from Fredericksburg, and that was so unique to me. Well, there weren't so many here, but they lived here part of the year. They did work the peanuts in Mason County, And I think I remember more of the local people doing their peach work in early days. It was a family effort, but later there were some. The Hispanics did clear a lot of our fields. I would want to brag about how that was the biggest thing of consequence anybody ever did, to literally chop hundreds of trees down and dig or burn the roots out and to get a field. But a number of that fields were done by Hispanic workers.
A lot of stones there.
Yes,
Cool.
and you know that's the story all over the universe, that poor people have to do jobs that other people don't want to do. And so they came and did a lot of that work that other people didn't want to do. Really, like I have a book that shows the wage earners at Balanced Rock where they had the quarry. Well, the German people were hired. They had bigger salary than the Hispanic workers. There's some of these things you shouldn't even say or want to write down, but they're all true. Mm-hmm. And then if the other bad thing about it in those days was like at Enchanted Rock, Mr. Arhelger, there was a piece of stone that flew in his eye and blinded him, both eyes. Well, in those days, there was no workers' compensation. There was, well, don't bother to come back tomorrow. So that was bad for everybody. People gritch about things like Social Security, and I can name families were totally destitute in the country as far as food. When they got old and couldn't work, they didn't have children or something, that shot their spouse and themselves out of desperation. So government programs have some good points in saving lives and helping children and old people and disabled people. He did Medicare and Medicaid, and I wrote that in the paper here too, that there'd be a lot of families that wouldn't have motor homes in their homes when they were old if they had to pay for all their medical expenses. Some of them just sit at the doctors, and that's because Lyndon Johnson did Medicare and Medicaid. Medicaid is if you're destitute, you're not going to be lying by the city gates, you're going to be in the nursing home. So I'm not pushing him, but I know his good points. So when some people are jealous or tacky, I have something to come back on. It's all factual, I think. Here's the key thing with Lyndon Johnson. He was desperately poor as a child, and he became very wealthy through his wife and businesses and notoriety of being high positions. He never forgot the little people. I think one of the best lessons he had is when he taught in that poor Hispanic school when he got out of college. He saw those kids had no future. They were going to work menial jobs and never have anything to speak of the rest of their lives. He never forgot the poor people. And a lot of people become wealthy. They don't even want to know anybody that doesn't have money. So I give him credit for that. Well, I'd give him the same thing I gave the Japanese children. I went to a Japanese high school through a friend, and I told him, now don't adapt the bad things from the Western culture. Keep your good qualities and take the best from the Western culture. You know, I mean, you can enjoy the music. Even in Germany, when I'd be over there, these young kids would be standing around the square in leather jackets and just standing around. And I thought, my God, that would not have been 20, 30 years ago. And they have graffiti in the substations, and that would have never been in Germany 30, 40, 50 years ago. Somebody would have been cleaning it off while they were spraying it. But that, you know, cultures, it's always easier to adapt to the easier, maybe the worse, than the better qualities. Well, if anybody says they would have stayed married every day of their lives, they're lying. There's some ups and downs. But, you know, like I've proven, and, you know, in my family, although my parents were divorced, my half-brother and half-sister by June will be married 70 years each, and in July we will be married 50. So out of 3 children, we will have 190 years of marriage. So that wasn't always easy, I'm sure, for any of the 3 couples, but you just go with the good points and try to be good and do the better and make it. The first night of college at a street dance. Very first night at a mixer at a street dance. So we've been dancing almost 60 years because we knew each other 9 years before we married. So I guess we're going to have a celebration on our 60th dance night, I guess. We both danced twice this past weekend. Well, she had some trouble. It took 2 days, and my father sweat blood because when he was 12, he had to go by his mother's bed when she was dying with her 9th child from internal bleeding. In 1934, his bride of 11 months died, the baby, and she died a few days apart in childbirth. So when my mother had trouble in the 1940s, he'd been through that a second time. But when my wife had trouble, it was his third time. And he would just go down the hall and not say a word. It was so hard on him. But then Jeffrey was born, and it was his only grandchild. He just thought, he would have done anything, anytime. Well, my father was the type, when we married, he said, you can have my little house in the country and I'll move in the hunter's cabin, which was a tin building with basics. And I said, yeah, what would people say if I let my father go live in a hunter's cabin, took his house? But I know somebody who did it. But I wouldn't have considered that. I would have been a cad, I think. But he wanted to do that to help us. And there's a very special stone in one of our fireplaces that was in his patio, and it was rippled, and he would clean his boots when he came out of the pasture on that stone. And Peggy loved that rock. So one day he comes down there with the tractor to our house with that rock, and it was put in our fireplace. So I think if Peggy took anything out of the house, it would be that rock.
Were you at the hospital when your son was born?
Oh, yes. We were all there, her family, my family, mother and father, and her parents and her sisters and her aunt, and just a big crowd. And then Mrs. Norman Deedle, Catherine Deedle, did a beautiful thing. She took a lot of shots because she was one of the photographers for the Radio Post. And she came up to the hospital, this whole booklet you could go through and see all the pictures she put in there with captions written under it. It's a real heirloom for Jeffrey. I'd have to think about that a while because I'm very happy with the way Fredericksburg is. It's a vibrant, healthy, growing community with parameters, shrubs in front of our businesses and sign ordinances. We're doing a wonderful growth. What I would miss, I guess, really, is being in the post office, knowing everybody in line, and walking across to the bank and knowing everybody in line, and chatting with everybody, and seeing people at the grocery store and knowing 95% of the people. It took you so long to go grocery shopping because you'd run into this person and that person. When we married, in the restaurant, poor Peggy would sit there at the table because I went to almost every table in the restaurant to talk to the people. So that's over. Now if you see some in the restaurant or in line, you want to run over and hug them because it's the only person around that you know well. And I know a lot of people, but I mean that small town, almost like extended family. And the minute you knew somebody, it was like a computer in your head. You knew everything about their family, their grandparents, great-grandparents. There's a couple that moved here with had a name that was not very well received here in the old days. And they said, I did exactly what everybody did they met. When I saw them, I had this very negative opinion in my head, and they were very refined, well-dressed people. And when I met them and they said their name, I said, oh. Everybody we meet here, when we meet them, they say, oh, because the computer wasn't jiving with all my knowledge about that name. Rosa Parks, people like that made a real difference. I can't think now. Over 60, the names don't come to you.
It's okay.
But
maybe Moisebar.
Well, yes, he'd be certainly interesting and was so scholarly and did. Many people are alive here because of him. We would have died in the starvation or in the Indian attack or something. So I give him credit for that. But Dr. Schweitzer, all these people who were really, really unique, and we have a record of. There were many fabulous people there's no record of. They might have been the person who nursed their old parents for 15 years or stayed with them or something. There are many heroes we don't know about, but there's some public figures that really, I would love to sit down with Lyndon Johnson because he was such a unique character. No, I wanted to teach or be a pastor from little on, so I did one of those. I didn't go the pastor route because I would have been so disappointed in people. I knew a Lutheran pastor at Doss who said those people were active in the church, nothing happened. One Sunday they walked out the door and never came back. He died never knowing what the reason was. That type of thing. You can't be disappointed in human nature if you're a pastor. You have to be able to go over that. And like, if you're ugly to me, I'm not mad at you, but it'll hurt me for days. I don't like ugly people. But when people are, we had splits in our church as early as the first year, and in 1887, and I mean that in our churches here. So people have been temperamental, or whatever you want to call it, for a long time. But teaching, I really enjoyed teaching, and I loved my students. They come up all the time to Peggy and me, and you hear success stories and why they like a certain thing. Or one person at a dance said, I remember a list you gave us in the class where there were all these questions, and the last question was said, don't do any of these. And I gave explicit instructions that they should read the whole thing before they started, which nobody did. He remembered that, 40, 50 years later. I have students on Social Security, so I can say 50 years later.
Isn't that amazing?
Well, at 76, I wasn't that much older than my first students, so they're 10 or less years younger than me. But it was a real downer the first time I walked up to a student. He told me he was on Social Security. Oh, I don't have any time to think about it. It is not pleasant in that you have a limited time, but I wouldn't. The only thing I worry about is that I wouldn't be able to work. We still have a pastor in this town that said when he got here 20-something years ago, people in nursing home would say, I'm good for nothing anymore because I can't work. And he'd say, well, Jesus loves you. Well, that may be true, but I'm good for nothing because I can't work. If the old people sat in the corner of the kitchen, they tried to shell the peas or there's a story of an old father-in-law, Mr. Weiss, when he couldn't walk anymore, then he was crawling around the backyard trying to throw wood a few feet and then throw it again, crawling. And his daughter-in-law said, why are you doing that? You don't need to do that. He said, I want to help you. Now that's work ethic.
It's amazing.
Luckily, she was interviewed in the 1930s and wrote all that stuff down about her terrible life. And that was one of the things that I remember. By the way, her mother, I believe it was her mother, died having a nosebleed. She laid down faint from the nosebleed, and one of those screwworm flies that used to eat up the animals alive when they'd get in their wounds, that fly laid an egg in her nose there, and she didn't know it. But later, those crawling, worms, and they had to tie her down until it ate into her brain. I mean, not a pleasant, but that's another danger of the frontier that most, one person said, you have to teach happy history. I said, they didn't have any happy for the first 15 or 20 years. So, and then that mother died, and those children suffered terribly from their stepmother. There were Cinderella stories that were real, based on real situations. And then Mrs. Lincoln did extra work so Abraham could get some schooling. So I told my kids they were very good stepmothers. If you have one, this is an indication of anything. There were good and bad people, good and bad stepmothers. But he was a famous example of wouldn't have gone anywhere without that stepmother. See, if I waxed a floor or put in a fence post or mowed the yard, I feel such accomplishment. Peggy was reared with a maid, so it was drudgery to her. And I lied to her because I told her for 50 years German people did their own work, and then at her birthday a friend of ours brought her maid along to do everything. It's so wonderful when everybody leaves and everything's done, the kitchen, all the dishes, everything. But perseverance was, you just did it. There was no discussion, and I mean, people worked from sun off to sunset. When they did go to a dance or a birthday party, then they had a nice time. And people were happy when you came to see them on Sunday afternoon, because then they didn't have to work. They could relax a little bit. Genuinely happy. Perseverance. My father never started any job he didn't think he could finish if it was a Friday. He said, if you don't get finished, then other things can come up the following week and you don't get that job done. You don't start something on Friday, you can't finish that day. Well, Kerrville tore almost everything down. They didn't have as much as we had to start with, but they tore so many things. New Braunfels has so many parking lots downtown. This Historical Society has been key to this. I mean, we did everything but throw ourselves in front of some of the bulldozers to say we didn't win every battle, but we won some of them. So that's why we have such a good success rate with the residents. And there were other factors. Like I told the Klingelhofer house, they were so lucky they were on a corner. And right across the street there was a service station. And almost all the way down the street, over half of the corners were service stations when the cars started traveling. And I said, if you had been a block over, that house probably wouldn't be there because it would have been torn down to be a service station, which are almost a thing of the past now. But at that time, they became big items. There were like 2 or 3 on the public square downtown at one time. The marketplace was put there to be a Marktplatz by Moisebach, but then the first school was on the corner where the fire station, City Hall are. And so the first school was on that square. So Colonel Petch saw that square was given to the school district. And to make money, the school district rented plots to be a car lot, service station, little office building for 50 years, that type of thing, to make the money. And then the Newcomers came and said, we have to have that for a park for us. Well, I knew they wanted it for the tourists, so that was okay. And I was a big brawl at City Hall about that because some people wanted this school to give it to the city. And I said, the city doesn't even give a discount to the school on electricity. Why should they give them the square? And I said, why don't you, I told one family, you own a block, 2 blocks from Main Street, why don't you donate that to the town? He said, I wouldn't think that was a good idea. I said, well, the kids don't have to give their land away. That was the Marktplatz war that I went through. Yeah, they had a baseball field and just about anything on the square. In earlier days, it was often where the businesses burned their trash. One woman said, what do you talk about beautifying the square to its original? She said it was a weed lot when I grew up. But tourism won out. And that's the interesting history there because that was our first recorded male cross-dresser there. Terry Bond's great-grandfather, in fact, he had his field there, and he came home during the Civil War to plow those fields for his wife, and he wore her clothes so the Confederates wouldn't see who it was. They would leave a woman alone. So I always teased Terry, I said, he was the first cross-dresser in Fredericksburg. And then my great-great-grandmother, Kat, was the first woman cross-dresser that we know of because she was home alone and there were Indians on the hill, so she went in the house and put her husband's clothes on and carried a rifle out into the yard. Well, I guess those Indians thought we don't want to die today, so we'll go on. And she did that. So we would tease each other about his ancestor and mine. Oh, the tree, Pat's Hall? Well, that was first Sipes out there. They didn't have codes on building materials at that time. And Sipes Hall, it was Sipe family had it. It caught fire where people didn't. Luckily, it was earlier where people hadn't arrived much. But Mrs. Sipes and I think a couple of the employees or somebody, died. It was just went up in flames in seconds, you know. So that was completely removed, and then later, I think the Patronellas were among those that had dances there later, and everybody nicknamed it Pat's Hall instead of Patronella. I don't think some Germans knew how to say Patronella. So it was very, very popular for young people. I don't remember families going to the dances there as much as lots of teenagers. That cupola on it,
yes.
that was Temple Smith's idea. He was a New Yorker, at least later, and he built that beautiful, very lot of cut stone on it, and then that unique cupola on it with Spanish tile on the little top, very unusual here. And they lived upstairs and had the bank downstairs. The other one uptown, that bank, the Pattons lived upstairs and had the bank downstairs.
Which building is that?
Well, it's across from the old Knapp Metzger's. West End Pizza Parlor was in there last. I forget what business is in there now. But it's where that palm tree died in this last February freeze. 100 years there and killed it. That was grieving to me. The Pattons, they had their store, which is now an art gallery next door. Their store was next to it, and they had the bank and the store. Well, it was a giant palm, 2 stories high, because it was right next to that 2-story rock building, and it was always sheltered. But that February freeze, you know, was like only the 2 worst freezes we had in 175 years, and it just killed it. Well, this was all Kaisers. The Kaisers lived in that 2-story red brick house there on College Street, and they had all this land here. They had a house on the Galveston seawall, big ranching family. I don't think there's ever been a poor Kaiser. And, well, it means king in German. Mrs. Kaiser was an old lady that lived in that house, and her daughter built that red brick house across the street that the Bierschwals, she married a Staling. Denise Staling lives in now. That was her daughter. I have pictures of Cross Mountain over here, these few blocks out. There's not a house or anything around that whole hill, and the housing divisions are right up to the land of the hill now. Well, we didn't have any paved roads the first at least 80 years, I guess. That was more either in the 20s or 30s when we even got bridges over the rivers. There were low water crossings. That one on the San Antonio Highway, there was a doctor that drank a lot, and he'd missed that little culvert, and there was a farmer who'd always pull him out with his horse team and made extra money. I know something about every foot.
That trip Johnson made to Fredericksburg, apparently he had to ford the rivers, and it was quite a journey just to go from Johnson City to Fredericksburg.
Everywhere. You know, that's dumb talk about why his grandmother is buried in on the ranch, and his grandfather's buried in the Stonewall Cemetery, or vice versa. Well, when one of them died, the river was up, and they couldn't get the body across the river, so they buried. So the people want to say, well, why aren't they buried together? Because there's a reason.
It was hard to get around.
Yeah. So, no, when we zip across a bridge now, we need to be thankful that, because that used to be a death wish sometimes. In the old days, if you'd get pneumonia going through that water, then you could get pneumonia and die. So every little thing we have was the pioneers went without. "92% of the people in the county gave to that hospital. And that was mainly Shorty Krenwalge. He went to almost every house he could find and asked them, just do something, just give us something. That one woman looked at what her husband gave, and she said, you can do better than that. He had some stories about going to the houses. Not ugly, because he wouldn't tell an ugly story, but wouldn't give the name, but he told Some people you ask, they can't write the check fast enough, and then other people hem and haw for 30 minutes, even if they have it. Well, we've had both.
Yeah.
We had good hospitals before that big one too, but they were outdated then when you have to have doors a certain width and all of this type of thing, which is needed, but they were outdated, so those two doctors from the two hospitals, Dr. Perry and Dr. Feller, did everything towards doing that new building, and the people stepped up. And it's first class, and that's also lucky to a lot of newcomers with money, because maybe it's selfish, but they want to have a good hospital if they get sick, so that's major donors to the hospital. Well, we built a beautiful base here in a beautiful town, and the newcomers have done beautiful additions. I said, this is a joint effort of us. I never say anything about that my family has been here, all 8 families for 175 years, and they got here yesterday. They're just as important as I am. My dad wouldn't buy me a cup of coffee that I'm from 8 families that settled here. You didn't know that, did you? Every one of my 8 families that came to North America has lived in this county. So if you see local yokel in the dictionary, that's my face in there. Well, they kidded Lyndon Johnson about that, because his birthplace and his grandparents' home and his aunt and uncle's house is all there within about a mile. So they said, well, you didn't go very far in life. You never got off this mile. He wanted that house because that was a big house for that time. His aunt and uncle were more affluent than they were. So Lady Bird thought he was totally nuts when he wanted that old rundown farmhouse. But she turned it into a lovely, eclectic home. It's the original house with additions. It's not a southern mansion or a big new modern thing. She tied it in very tastefully, I think. But she didn't want that house originally. That was his dream. Like when I was little, that was one of the bigger houses, and I want to have that. That's the Lindick home. Mrs. Weinheimer was very instrumental in, and another the lady who bought it donated it, and Mrs. Weinheimer was instrumental, I think, of Mrs. Black, in moving it there. It had to be moved, and they did a beautiful job for that little town. It's a very good restoration, and they have wonderful programs. They have speakers, historical speakers, and for a little town, they do an excellent job. When I retired, I did that for a few years, and I didn't stop talking for the whole hour and a half on the tour. Never used a tape one day, and a lot of them used tapes. Never used a tape. Every plant or animal or building I had something to say about, and it was well received. Nobody ever said you talked too much. But
you're saying you did tours at the
yes,
the Johnson,
and they were very, very personalized. You drove the bus and you talked, and now the machine is canned and it's got certain aspects, but you don't get the real personalities of the people and the land that way. And of course, I knew a lot about this area, and it was kind of embarrassing sometimes because people would call and want to go on my tour. I don't say they didn't do it for any of the others, but when they called, they'd been there longer, and some of them thought, who does he think he is? But I was enthusiastic about it. And like you heard me talk about Johnson, I think there's a lot of goods to say. Well, when I grew up, that was Engels. Engels had their home there. Engels put in the post office. Engels built the store. They built the dance hall. You went to Engels to sell your eggs. You went to Engels to dance. You went to Engels to the store. That whole geographical area of people that went to the Luckenbach school, that was all called Luckenbach. And then later Hondo Crouch and Geach Cook put that on the map when they bought it, and it became called Luckenbach Town. And they did a very good job of promoting it. Well, in the old days when you protected your family and you found your food with hunting, that was a big deal. I got in a lot of trouble with a gun nut one time in the class because I said hunting is not that important anymore because we don't need it for food or defense. And she thought hunting and guns were the most important thing in the universe. And her mother got upset, and I thought, oh God, I thought all the Neanderthals had died out. Well, it's just, you can have a hobby with baseball or you can go to your church, but you don't have to be nuts about it. Because a lot of people disagree with you that it's not as important to them. I mean, it is a true statement that guns are not as important to your survival and defense and food as they were, period. My wife got into trouble with some religious nut because she taught Greek mythology, and she said she was teaching false religions. Well, my wife wrote her a letter that would appeal the paint off the walls, and the principal said, you can't write that. She said, well, then you write it, because my wife was a scholar from the city, and she didn't know there was anybody that ignorant. So imagine, you're going to have a nut. If you have 152 students like I did, there's going to be one or two parents that are nuts. She grew up in Memorial, which was one of the finer neighborhoods in Houston, and her father was a very successful dentist. Interestingly, about his family, they were 4 children from a little German farm in Belleville. His mother had been a fisher, and she married an English Logan, which was probably interesting at the time. And 3 boys became dentists, and the daughter married a doctor, MD. So they all went a long way from the farm, and he had a good practice there. And Peggy grew up with a, full-time maid and the 5 girls, because there were 4 daughters and their mother, and they just ran around shopping and things. She didn't have really very many responsibilities, but she was very scholarly. Peggy was an honor student from little on, and she could have been an MD, but girls didn't do that then. Not 1 in 10,000. You became a teacher, secretary, of this, that, and the other, not a deep sea diver or an astronaut or anything. So she taught reading specialists. She got her master's in reading and was very successful helping kids in that. But there were no openings in the district. So this is a true story. She got the job without applying at Dawes, Texas, a 4-room, only 2 rooms used for a rural school, 1 through 8. And she got 1, 2, 3, 4. She'd never taught little children. She was never below middle school. And she said, I can't accept that. I don't want it. And her superintendent said, where she taught, that'll be the most fabulous experience that you could never buy, to teach in a rural school, and then later you can go to the city, but wonderful experience. And then she did love it. Like when she was expecting, she walked into one of those empty rooms and half the community was there, that rural community. They gave her a baby shower. There were just a lot of advantages to that little school. We're still sort of honorary members of Dawes, Texas. Probably population right in town, about 7 or something. And then she came into town, and the only opening was 1st grade. But, the second year she taught in Dawes, they came to her and said, well, we're adding kindergarten. So you'll have kindergarten 1, 2, 3, 4 next year. It's a lot of preparations. And but it was basically a good experience. Then 1st grade here, she had one girl that cried. Very dear to us, very good friend's daughter, but she cried every day for months. She was scared or something. I don't know what the reason was. She's a very successful CPA now. So, but she taught then until she could get into middle school, where she was a reading specialist. She did teach several subjects like English and other things originally. Like I taught probably every subject in the school, PE, everything at one time. But then I specialized in Texas history because of my interest to the local. One principal said, you need to be in Texas history. It ties in with everything you are. And of course I did really, really enjoy that.